part of, I think this is the longest chapter in Levin and Schultz on what can the fossil record tell us about human evolution. So we'll do part one, which basically will go from bipedalism up through what is called early Homo. And then next time we'll do the second half or second part of the chapter, taking us through Homo sapiens. I want to start off with three big points about human evolution that we're going to be looking at throughout, because it's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of material. Like I said, it's the longest chapter in the book. And it strikes me that in the last class, for example, we covered primates in one class, or we tried. There's a whole course this semester called Monkey and Ape Behavior, Anthropology, I think 350, that you can take, taught by Professor Connie Anderson, and you can spend the whole time just on monkey and ape behavior. And the same thing with human evolution. We could probably spend a whole semester doing that, but we're going to do it fast, super fast. So some of the main points. First big point, I would say, is that it's a very complex story. It has a lot of twists and turns in it, and it seems to be getting more complicated the more I'm teaching it. 15 years ago or so, when I started teaching in here, there were perhaps fewer twists and turns. So it seems to be getting harder to do. It's more complicated than ever before. We'll talk about why that is a bit, but I just want to emphasize this from the beginning, that there's a lot of complexity. As we saw with the non-human primates, a lot of variation and diversity throughout the process of human evolution. Given that complexity, we're going to concentrate on two kind of sub-themes of that evolutionary process. There's two main ideas that will help us, hopefully, to organize kind of the main thread of how humans, what is deeply human about our evolution. And the first of those is the idea of being mobile, and our human mobility, which allows us to migrate, to move to different places, to walk and to run over long distances. We're one of the only mammals that can run marathons, if we're fit enough to do that. So being mobile is essential to it has been from the beginning, to the identity of being human. And so we hear a lot today about people migrating and immigrants and people moving from place to place. And I want to emphasize that this has been going on for hundreds of thousands, millions of years, that as it's a fundamental part of us being human is our mobility and being able to move and migrate into different areas. The second, I guess here it appears as number 3, but the second theme that's going to help us organize this complexity is the growing importance of learned behavior in the story of human evolution. So in the old days, we told a story of human evolution that was all about the biology first and the learning second. And we've come to realize that our ability to learn things from our previous generations is a very deep issue or a very deep part of human identity. It goes back, we basically became human because of our learned behavior. So these are the two sub-themes that will help us, I hope, organize the material, which is going to be in a lot of different places, kind of like the primatology material. It's complicated, but hopefully this will help us to organize it into some main themes. So I want to talk a little bit about why it is that when it comes to human evolution, there are so many seemingly debates, and this can be a hotly contested field of studies. So a lot of people get very into their own hypothesis about what creatures belong where, what you should call if there are different species. Now, I don't want to take this too far and say that they are debating whether humans evolved. These are all debates within a process that we know happened of human evolution. It's simply competing hypotheses or competing ideas within that overall evolutionary theory. So we know the overall picture. The overall story is fairly clear, but what exactly happened when, those specifics are up for a lot of debate and have a lot of sort of mystery around them. And so what accounts for all the things that we don't know in these fierce debates and mysteries? So I was happy that so many of you got into the dentition stuff. And you read about how, it's amazing how they're classifying the Australopithecus based on the shape and the dentition and the tooth and the enamel and this, and it's just so into teeth. And I just love the teeth, and everybody loves the teeth. But the problem, why do we get so into teeth? What is it about teeth? Well, we try to figure out what we can eat from our teeth, although we found out that we're not that great at predicting what creatures ate based on their teeth. We're trying, we're getting better at it. But why do people get so into teeth? This may be a trick question. You ever know if a building collapses or something and you can't find any remains and the only thing that are left are the teeth? That's exactly what's happening here. A lot of times, that's all we have. And so because that's all there is, people have had to make a lot of inferences or a lot of suppositions based on a very fragmentary fossil record. So there have been whole ideas based on a jawbone with some teeth. It would be wonderful to have more than that, but sometimes they're just in it, isn't. Which brings us to our next issue, is that the fossil record is not a complete fossil record. To say that 5% even exists, that is, it would be out there to find, is probably way too optimistic. Maybe it's more like 1% or 0.1%. Because most of the time, when we're alive, all the creatures that are alive, we're trying not to be fossils, trying to move around and live and do our thing and get by, as Dylan tells us. We're just trying to get by and not become fossilized. Don't want to have that happen to us. Don't want to fall into a tar pit or something and become a fossil. And then if you do have the misfortune of falling into a tar pit, probably some other creature is going to try and come along and eat you. And so very few creatures actually end up becoming fossils. 5% is probably way too optimistic. Maybe it's more like 0.1%, even if we can find it. And so this varies quite a bit by region. There are some regions which are much more productive than others. And so we get a lot of the human story, for example, from East Africa. That's been a very productive region. That doesn't mean it was the only place that was happening in Africa. There were other stuff going on probably in West and Central Africa, but it simply was not a productive region for fossils, for climatology reasons, for one. And even in productive regions, there might be huge gaps in the amount of time that goes by. So you might miss 100,000 years where you basically have very little fossil evidence. And if you don't have evidence to go on, that can lead into these kind of hypotheses that simply can't be supported or can't be falsified by the evidence. The other issue is that one of the things that we're trying to do, right, one of the key parts of evolution is to figure out if we have a species. And as you perhaps know from your biology classes before, we talk about defining a species by it being able to interbreed and then have interbreeding viable offspring. And so in the world and in the living world that we see, we can just put some creatures close together and see if they interbreed and produce viable offspring. And then we say, aha, species, there it is. But with fossils, who knows? You have these, you have these bones and teeth, and then you say, well, could this creature that we found interbreed with this other creature that we have the bones for? Very difficult to tell from fossils alone. And so there are some people who every time there's a new fossil will be like, aha, new species, must be a new species. They call those the splitters, because it's fun to find a fossil and then, especially if you get to name it yourself and you're like, I found a new species. So those would be the splitters. Then there's other people who basically think that a lot of the fossils we find are simply variation within a species. So if another fossil is found, they're like, nah, that's just, that's just a big version of this other thing that we already knew about. They call those people lumpers because they want to lump all them in together. So the point is, it's very difficult to tell from fossils what is going on in terms of whether or not a species could interbreed. And this goes back to something that Emma raised a point back in the chapter on the primates. There's a box there that talks about hybridization. When you have gene flow between creatures that usually seem like they might be a separate species, but every so often, if they get together under the right conditions, they have offspring. And so we used to think this was quite rare. It turns out to be a lot more common than we think, especially at the edges of geographic zones. And it can have a huge influence in evolution if creatures that are close to becoming a separate species then get together again and hybridize. It can rewrite sections of their genetic code or duplicate them, as you saw in that little video, where you might get two snips of genetic code. So hybridization turns out to be one more common than we thought. And sometimes you may have seen animals like we would think that lions and tigers are from different species, but you can actually get them together and come up with a liger. So a lot of these things that we thought were different species the possibility of hybridization exists. So this has become an important issue in how we see evolution. And this leads to the reason we know that there has been this hybridization is that as we have gathered more genetic evidence and tried to deduce the histories of various organisms based on how their genomes have changed, it's been obvious that their history is more complicated than we thought before. So this has been, like I said, it seems to keep getting more complicated to teach, because in some ways we're seeing in the genetic evidence, we thought the genetic evidence was just going to sort everything out for us, that it would be clear cut, that it would make things less complicated. In fact, it seems to be making things more complicated in the sense that it introduces some ideas that then have to be looked for in the fossil evidence, or comes up with stuff that we would have never been able to deduce simply from the fossils alone. So these are some of the reasons why things are really complicated and why the debates within the field of human evolution can be quite fierce. People get very attached to their ideas. So we're going to try and give us the sort of state of the art, but know that there are things, things can change over the years. So I'm going to start with what we used to think about human evolution. And by used to think, I'm going to go back, I don't know, how about 60 or 70 years ago, into maybe the 1950s or so. Maybe 100 years ago, what we used to be thinking about, we were looking for when we looked at how humans evolved. People used to be very hung up on cranial size, the size of a creature's brains. And this perhaps has to do with the fact that scientists are obsessed with their own smartness, and they think that humans have to be smarter than all other creatures, and that scientists have to be smarter than all other humans. And so they were looking for the divergence, and they were always trying to measure creatures' brains. And so that's what they were looking for in the fossil record, was they thought that that's what would differentiate the humans from the other primates. The other thing that we used to look for is the idea, which comes to us, remember, from the great chain of being, which is not what we want to use in evolution, but it was still around during much of the thinking through evolutionary processes. And the idea is that all the creatures, because of what Lavin and Schultz call, following Darwin's ideas and the development of Darwin's ideas, phyletic gradualism, the idea that every creature was gradually changing, and that evolution only worked in a really, over a long period of time, super small changes, so that everything had to be arranged so that every creature had to have an immediate ancestor, and we were always looking for these missing links of the chain between creatures, because we were convinced that it had to be a gradual, over millions of years process. This, of course, led us to the search for these kind of nice, smooth and straight lines, or that picture that you might have of the four stages where you're progressively getting more upright until then you've gone from fish to walking along in about 5 pictures. And so the idea here that we used to look for is these nice trunks of trees, you might say, that would lead from one creature straight into another. And as we've discussed, there wasn't anything except the fossil evidence. That was all that was there. And so people would deduce a lot from whatever they could find in the earth or in the bones, because that was the only evidence that was around. As I mentioned, this also led to the idea that there was a lot of biological change first. We got big brains first, and then people would do the tools. They would make tools because only big-brained creatures can make tools. And then they would learn. And then that culture was a relatively recent development, maybe 20,000 years ago or 40,000 years ago. So the idea was that people became biologically human a long time before they became, what we might say, culturally human. Again, all of this stuff is our previous idea of what we were looking for, and it led to allow people to be easily fooled by some hoaxes. There were some very famous hoaxes, like the Piltdown Man, which somebody just took a cranium of an old human and a jaw of a chimpanzee, and because people were looking for the missing link, it was easy to believe a hoax like this. So we want to be careful with these what we might call worn out assumptions. So now, what do we think now? First of all, we are not looking for missing links. If anybody tells you that they have found the missing link, that's probably a sign that they are working with an outdated idea of biological evolution. What we are looking for is most recent common ancestors. So species that go back, so that when we go back, there is a derivation from or some sort of divergence from one set of creatures which give rise to other sets of creatures. And so we're not looking for some sort of precise intermediate stage, because those actually don't exist neatly in that old great chain of being idea. So when we think about humans, we think that the most recent common ancestor was like, perhaps, what we can observe contemporarily as the chimpanzees or the bonobos. As we mentioned in the last class, there was a speciation after the most recent common ancestor between chimps and bonobos. But we can't say that that most recent common ancestor was exactly like today's chimpanzees or exactly like today's bonobos, because they have also been evolving all along. They were not, no one got stopped 6 million years ago. Everyone has continued to micro-evolve and macro-evolve into their own environments. What we now know is that the divergence between the creatures that would lead into today's apes is one in which the hominins became increasingly bipedal first. So it wasn't that they got smarter, it wasn't that their brains got bigger first, it was that they became habitually bipedal first. And we think that divergence came around, in the range of 6 to 8 million years ago. And it's a very slow process of divergence, and there was probably a lot of cross-back hybridization as well. So that when we see, when we look for what are truly the representatives of our ancestors of that period, we see creatures with brains, with craniums that are pretty much the same as ape size, but they're starting to become more mobile, more habitually bipedal. We also know, in contrast to the idea that everything is a smooth, straight line, that there has been lots of different species. It's hard to say, again, how many exactly, but there have been a lot of different kinds of bipedal species all the way through, from all the early bipedal species up through different forms of Homo species as well. That through all this period, there's been an enormous range of variation. And so we now see something that we call, or Levenschultz called, mosaic evolution, which is, instead of thinking of things as only gradually changing and one creature transforming into another, different parts combine in different ways and seem to evolve at different speeds. We'll see this in actually a little bit more in the next class on Tuesday, when we talk about Homo naledi, which is a more recent find, which combines features that we thought were, some of which we thought were older and some of which we thought were younger, combines them in a different form of a mosaic. And so this is how we think evolution proceeds, more than kind of just gradual transformation, as it puts things into different places and can happen relatively quickly. So the idea, in contrast to, or I would say perhaps more, which is to say now, in unison with the gradualism, with phyletic gradualism, is the idea of punctuated equilibrium, which basically posits that things often stay very stable for a long period of time, but then there are these periods of fairly rapid change in which several new species can appear and others can go extinct quite rapidly. This was an idea that has been around for a while. Some of you asked, well, how does that mean species are happening all around us all the time? Not exactly. I mean, when we say rapidly, it's still in evolutionary times. We might be talking over 100,000 years instead of 1 million years. So it's still slow in human terms. In our lifetime, we're not going to see this kind of thing go on, but it can happen geologically or evolutionarily more quickly than we once imagined. We also now can combine the fossils with the genetic evidence, which, as I talked about, does not necessarily make things easier. Our sense of what happened, geology, and our computerized reconstructions of climate have improved tremendously from what they were 70 or 100 years ago. So we have more than simply the fossils to go on now. And we've learned through this, as we discussed, that being able to learn and pass on that learning from in each generation and from our peers, that tool making and what we might call culture then are extremely deep. And so we can't separate out the biological from the culture. Going back to a term we used at the very beginning of the course, humans are biocultural organisms. And so our culture, our learned behavior, is key to how we actually evolve to become the humans that we are. And so instead of thinking about this as humans biologically evolving, getting smart, and then adding on tools, we think that tools are intimately related to different changes in the neural structure, in how we started to live and how we started to pass on knowledge from one generation to the next. And so we have been co-evolving, or we've been evolving together with our tools for at least 2.5 million years, which is when we find the first, you might say, concrete evidence of stone tools in the anthropological and archaeological record. All right, so let's talk about bipedalism, or walking on 2 feet. So we start to see some bipedal hominoids. That basically means walking apes, which we term hominins. So hominins is the term for bipedal hominoids. They start to appear at, perhaps as early as 10 million years ago, definitely by 5 million years ago. There we have evidence of some form of bipedalism. Now, in the old days, we used to think that that meant that this big-headed creature was going out onto the African savanna with a spear and popped its head up and was ready to hunt. What's going to happen to a big-headed creature on the African savanna popping its head up over the grasslands with a spear? The first thing that would happen to this smart person. What other creatures are on the grasslands of the African savanna that you can remember from, say, I don't know, the Lion King? Oh, wait, yes, lions. What is a nice lion going to do when he sees this human hunter pop their big head up with a spear? They're gonna be tackling the hunter. So this is a very funny image, actually, to me, because these early bipedal hominoids certainly would not have been striding out onto the savanna, popping their heads up in order to hunt. This is not how it worked, for various reasons. For one, the idea that the African savanna was simply grasslands does not seem to actually be what was going on 6 to 7 million years ago. There was some of the forest dying back, but it was probably still a more forested or a varied landscape than we once thought. And so there's a number of ideas that people have had about why it is that these creatures, these hominins, started to become more bipedal. So people have talked about being able to spot prey, or being able to see predators and run away, or being able to reach into the trees, or maybe it had less heat on your back because your head was not, your back was not exposed to the sun anymore, freeing the hands, being able to carry tools, carry your babies. Maybe it was less energy. Maybe it was being able to cooperate more. Maybe it was because over long distances you could endure and walk further. And maybe, as Lavin and Schultz say, following some ideas that they could then walk down, or endurance hunting ideas, kind of track animals over time. So there's a lot of different possibilities. And I guess I would say here that none of them has, there isn't one thing that we can say, aha, there's the single thing that determined that that creatures became more bipedal. So some people have argued that there might be a combination of factors. That some people have, of course, argued for their own idea in this. It's difficult to tell. One of the reasons I think it's difficult to tell is that, and these are kind of just thinking about bipedalism, it can hopefully be more interesting than simply the anatomical and skeletal changes. Some people have speculated that there were as many or more than 30 bipedal species at one point in time. And most of them didn't make it that long. Most of them went extinct. And so if you have all these species around and most go extinct, you might wonder, well, is bipedalism really that big of an advantage? Or are there some disadvantages to it as well? And maybe the creatures that kept being bipedal just kind of got lucky instead of had some sort of selective advantage. And as people get older and their backs and their spines start to get hard to use, you realize that, you know, being bipedal, I don't know, sometimes it's kind of hard on the system. So it's sometimes difficult to tell if there was an advantage to it as well. The other thing I'd like you to think about, and this again is a slightly controversial idea, but I just want to put it out there for you, which is that humans, unlike some creatures, sort of come out walking already or come out mobile, and humans don't. We learn how to walk. We learn how to walk with the assistance of our people who help us, because we're helpless for a long time. And for those of you who've been in different societies, we also learn how to walk in a particular way. And so we have different ways of teaching our children how to walk. Some people say that there are cultural differences in how people walk in different societies and how they're taught to walk. There are also individual differences in walking. Some people I know I was made fun of when I was in 7th and 8th grade for the way I walked. So this is something that is not necessarily one biological thing. It is something that is learned, and we have to sort of do it together. And we also have to help the people who are unable to walk as well. And so it is possible, and again, this is perhaps a controversial point, that this is one of those instances in which learned behavior becomes biologically incorporated into the human skeletal development. And it's not to say that walking isn't biological, of course it is, but it is also something that we learn to do. Now, most people are going to locate learning and culture later on with stone tools, and that's fine, but it is possible that it also happens at the walking point as well. All right, let's look at let's look at a skeleton here. This is Artipithecus the best example of Artipithecus ramidus, or Artie, and there's a number of creatures that fall into this grouping here. This find was officially announced in 2009, so relatively recent, although as your textbook says, the main people had been working on reconstructing this skeleton for 15 years before they actually announced it to the public. So people had known that that they were working on it, and they had understood that this was part of the evolutionary picture, but they really wanted to kind of get as much as they could. And it, like I said, they were working from fragments and really getting a lot of technology to get to here, to get to what is still, I mean, it's cool looking. It's not complete, but this was a huge project to reconstruct the skeleton to this point. If you look carefully at, this is on page 104, if you look carefully at Artie's toes, seems to have both an opposable thumb that we talked about with the primates, but also an opposable toe. So the toe is still able to do grasping. And so this has led to kind of different ideas. It seems like Artie is bipedal, but they're not bipedal in the sense of how we traditionally think of being able to push off with our toes, and that our toes aren't hanging out there like that. And so does that mean that Artie was bipedal on the ground and was primarily trying to grasp up from trees? Or some people have speculated that it's sort of a bipedal in the trees kind of thing, where you're walking along the tree limbs and being able to still be arboreal or still in the trees, but being bipedal up in the trees. Other people have made the argument that they're like, this doesn't even seem to be part of the main issue. It's like this is just off to the side. It's another creature, but maybe Artie wasn't really a part of the main line of human evolution. Maybe it's just a something that was a dead end. And so we've talked about how there's a lot of diversity in these, and a lot of species go extinct. Now, the people who discovered Artie and worked on reconstructing that skeleton for 15 years have been very fierce advocates that this is an extremely important find, and it is. But, I mean, you can see how people, if they've been working on something this much, can get attached to its importance. It's a cool thing, and it gives us a little bit of a picture of how complex and varied it may have been to develop bipedalism, that it wasn't simply as straightforward as we once thought. Now, Artie falls here between some of the earliest non-bipedal, you might say, apes, and the Australopiths, or what is a shorthand for we used to call the Australopithecus afarensis. And there's another Australopithecus, but now we are able to shorten it to just call them Australopiths. Don't be fooled, though. This is still this is Africa. These are finds from Africa. The most famous of the Australopiths was found in the 1960s or 70s was named Lucy because of the Beatles song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, which was playing on their radio when they found and there's an interesting account of that in that little text box on page 105. So Lucy is a very famous, perhaps the most famous of these finds from long ago. And what the Australopiths give us, as you can see in the Artie skeleton, it was like, well, maybe bipedal. The Australopiths seem to be quite, the skeletal evidence for bipedalism is better. Straighter spines, their toes seem to be shaped the right way. So the skeletal evidence is better for the Australopiths than it is for, say, Artie and other creatures. And then sometimes you just get really super lucky. There was a volcanic eruption of ash in this area around what is now Tanzania in Africa, in Laetoli. And in the ash, there are these footprints which then fossilized. And so, like I said, sometimes you get lucky because you get a volcanic eruption, and so you got a nice geological date on it. So we got, a pretty good 3.6 million years ago, which you don't always get. It's hard sometimes to figure out what strata things are in. You have the volcanic eruption, the layer of ash, the footprints, and skeletons around. And so the bipedalness is almost indisputable here, because they're starting to you can see where in the tracks they're pushing off with their toes. You don't have that opposable toe like you had with Artie. And so if you combine that together with the skeletal evidence that was already there in the Lucy and the other Australopith skeletons, you have this very good evidence of habitual bipedalism at 3 million, 2 million years ago. No, I mean, let's say 3.6. A little bit in the 3.6 million year ago range, you have good evidence both skeletally and in these tracks of habitual bipedalism. Still pretty much with ape-like crania, not necessarily a change in cranial size, but we definitely see a lot of walking around with these creatures. All right.